Right, comrades, well, I'll make the usual caveats at the outset, which is that one can't really talk satisfactorily about the whole rise and fall of the Roman Empire in the space of half an hour. And I'll also do the usual plug for the book. If you want to do the whole thing, then you have to buy the book, which I hope will not happen. However, nonetheless, what I will do is I will give you a 2-minute timeline to kick off, so you know where we're going. Rome, the Roman Empire which we're talking about today, existed in some sense from the 7th century BC up to the 5th century AD, and it began its history, its trajectory, as a relatively small Latin-speaking city-state in west-central Italy, and it ended its history, in fact it became this quite quickly, an absolutely massive empire which extended from Scotland to Iraq at its peak. And then, it's worth saying that initially it was ruled by kings, but for most of its history it was ruled by either a senatorial aristocracy for 500 years or by military dictators, the military dictators that we know as emperors or Caesars, for another 500 years. And then I'm going to stop with the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century AD. In other words, I'm not going to talk about what happens in the East, where in some sense, in some form, the Roman Empire continues for another 1,000 years until the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in the 15th century. I'm very much going to focus on what is happening in the western part of the empire. That's the very quick timeline. The rest of it is going to be theory, and I'm going to be dealing with really two arguments. One of them is a very easy argument to deal with, and it's an argument which has been around in classical scholarship for centuries, and it's still there, still very present in the way in which many people talk about the Roman Empire, and this is the idea that the empire was some kind of cross between the United Nations and the National Trust, spreading peace and culture through the benevolence of the empire builders. And I suspect that idea is still widespread because many of the people who spend their lives translating Latin poetry in a Cambridge college probably assume that if they were to be reincarnated in the Roman Empire, they would belong to the senatorial class. I think there's probably that kind of bias in the way in which the Roman Empire is traditionally viewed. That's a fairly easy argument, I think, for us to deal with as Marxists. A more difficult argument, which I'm also going to take on, is an argument that arises within the Marxist tradition, and that is the idea that, in some sense, the Roman Empire was progressive. It was extremely brutal, it was extremely violent, it was extremely exploitative, but in some sense, in terms of historical development, it was progressive compared with what had existed before, representing a stage in human social development. And this is the idea of an ancient mode of production or a slave mode of production which in some sense raises the productivity of labour, raises the level of technique, and thus in a sense moves humanity onto a new level. Now that's a very strong idea within the Marxist tradition that goes right back to the way in which Marx and Engels themselves talked about the ancient world generally and the Roman Empire in particular in the middle of the 19th century. I want to take that argument on too. I have one exhibit. Last year's exhibit in the Archaeology lecture was a Paleolithic hand axe, for those who were present for that. This year's exhibit is here. It's quite difficult to see it from where you are. This is garum, which is Roman fish sauce. The Romans would hang out fish to rot, and then the residue would be turned into an exotic condiment that was served on aristocratic tables. All that's left when you take it out of an amphora that's been in the Mediterranean for 2,000 years and you dry it out is of course the fish bone, but there it is, representing Roman luxury, representing Roman civilization. I'm going to leave it in private place there to keep us focused on this idea of Rome as representing civilization. Let's talking about the rise. Let's try and define the dynamic of the system. Ancient civilizations are based on, fundamentally they are based on the extraction of agricultural surpluses from primary producers. Now, in fact, those primary producers are of different statuses in different parts of the ancient world at different times. Sometimes they are indeed slaves. More often, they are something else. I mean, slavery is not the normal condition of the primary producer in the ancient world. Sometimes they are slaves. Sometimes they are serfs. Sometimes they are debt bondsmen. Debt bondage was a very important way in which people became tied to particular estates by getting into debt in the ancient world. Sometimes they were wage labourers. Sometimes they were tenant farmers who were simply paying a rent, or they were sharecroppers or whatever. Sometimes they were peasant freeholders who may not have been exploited by landowners, but were nonetheless exploited by the state, who extracted tribute, extracted tax from them. So in a variety of different ways, ancient civilization is based on the extraction of surpluses from primary producers working in agriculture. Technique changes very little. It's very important to stress this. There is development of technique, but it is on a long-term trajectory. So what you don't get as a primary dynamic in the ancient world is the investment of surpluses in the development of productivity and technique. You do get changes, but they're not fast enough for that to be an effective way for the ruling class to actually accumulate surplus in the way that happens, of course, after the Industrial Revolution with the development of capitalism. Yet, this ancient world is divided into competing polities. It's divided into different tribes, sometimes confederations of tribes. It's divided into different city-states, sometimes confederations of city-states. It's divided sometimes into kingdoms and even into empires, but it is always divided. So you have a situation of geopolitical competition, where different ruling classes, in control of different polities, are competing with each other for the control of surplus, which means the control of land, it means the control of labour, it means control, that is, of that productive base which generates the surpluses of the ancient world. There's a contradiction between the military competition which exists in the ancient world between these different entities on the one hand, and the very low level of technique, and the fact that technique is basically stagnant. So you're locked into a competition where if you want to accumulate resources rapidly to advance your position in this geopolitical conflict, you can't do it by raising the level of technique. You can't do what Stalin did in Russia in the 1920s and the 1930s, which is to say, we accumulate, we pour resources into the industrialization of Russia so that we can compete with the Western capitalist states. It's not an option, because the level of technical development is so slow. War, therefore, becomes a principal mechanism whereby ruling classes compete with each other to accumulate surpluses. Not only do they need to use war to defend their share of surplus, their land and their labour, they also increasingly use war proactively as a way of seizing the surpluses which are held by other ruling classes. Let me give you an illustration of that. I'm not going to give you many facts, because facts clutter the argument. I prefer to stick with theory. But I'll give you this one. Pompey the Great's eastern conquests, when he conquered part of what is now Turkey, the whole of what is now Syria, part of what is now the Levant. Pompey's eastern conquests in the 60s BC are estimated to have increased the revenue of the Roman state in total by 70%. So he's almost doubling the state's revenue. Now that is a direct consequence of successful warfare. So we need to be absolutely clear that war is a principal mechanism not whereby the level of surplus overall is increased, but whereby surplus is redistributed from one ruling class to another, from the less successful ruling classes to the more successful ruling classes, of which the Roman ruling class turned out to be the supreme example. And what are they doing when they accumulate surplus successfully, they are ploughing most of it into the development of the military machine. It's estimated that about 2/3 of Roman state expenditure was military expenditure. War, in other words, fuels war. War is an effective means of seizing the surplus held by other ruling classes. It's then invested in the development of the means of making war, and more wars, more accumulation becomes possible in that way. You have got direct transfers of surplus from defeated ruling classes to the most successful ruling class, which means in essence, if you want to encapsulate it, Rome is a system of robbery with violence. It's a system in which accumulation of surplus through successful warfare is fundamental to the dynamic of the system. How are those surpluses used? They're used partly to make further conquests. And let us be quite clear about how savage that process was. Between 58 and 51 BC, for example, Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul is estimated at, there were about 6 or 7 million people, we think, in Gaul at the time, roughly France and Belgium. His conquest is estimated to have killed 1 million, to have enslaved another 1 million, and to have destroyed 800 settlements. Now that's on the basis of his own account of the conflict. So genocidal warfare, ethnic cleansing on an absolute, mass enslavement on a massive scale. Secondly, those surpluses are used to fund competition inside the ruling class. The ruling class itself is split. There are aristocratic factions, there are warlords competing with each other. Those internal struggles for control of the state and control of the surplus, the control of the state gives you, those internal conflicts are fueled by the surpluses that come from successful warfare. So, between 49 and 45 BC, for example, there's a massive civil war that spreads across the whole of the Roman world between Caesar and Pompey at the head of two different warlord factions. Thirdly, that accumulation of military surpluses is used to control the subject population. Absolutely central, of course, throughout the history of class society is the role of the state in smashing revolt from below. One very clear, famous example of that, of course, is the destruction of the Spartacus Revolt between 73 and 71 BC, involving a massive internal deployment of the Roman army to smash a revolt which threatened to bring down the slave system, the slave plantation system that was on a very large scale in Italy at the time. Now, there is nothing progressive about any of this. There is this view of human social development that sees human society moving through a series of stages. Each stage, in some sense, more progressive than the stage which has preceded it. So, ancient society, the ancient mode of production, and the feudal mode of production, and the capitalist mode of production, and so on. And it's an idea that goes back to Marx and Engels. That is a mechanical, determinist view of history, and it clashes with other fundamental ideas of Marxism. Now, I haven't got time to deal with the argument as a whole. I mean, people might very well want to come back on this. Some of the traditionalists, the orthodox Marxists in the audience might want to come back on this in the discussion, in which case fine. I'm just at this stage going to make this point about it. Intensified exploitation of and the violent expropriation of primary producers lowers the level of technique and productivity. Surplus can be used in two different ways. Surplus can be used productively. Surplus can be used in investments which raise technique, raise the productivity of labour and actually move humanity forwards, or surpluses can be used wastefully. Ancient ruling classes used surpluses wastefully, to the extent that the Roman ruling class was successful in conquest and then in super-exploitation of the subject population of the empire. To the extent that it extracted surpluses successfully, those surpluses were invested primarily in maintaining the army and secondarily in creating great monuments and in supporting the luxury lifestyles of the elite and the subordinate groups which ruled the empire on behalf of the elite. That is all waste expenditure. It's not the investment of surplus in raising the level of technique and productivity. That is why I remember being at a meeting many, many years ago at Marxism, where Spartacus was the subject. And I won't identify the speaker. The speaker said, of course we sympathise with Spartacus. Of course we sympathise with Spartacus, but we understand his revolt was doomed. Because actually the Roman Empire represented progress. That position is false. Revolt from below is always progressive. And it's always progressive because to the extent that the producing classes keep control of more of the surplus, that surplus is more likely to be invested in the improvement of technique and raising the productivity of labour. To the extent that ancient and medieval ruling classes are successful in expropriating surplus and raising the level of exploitation, you get the consumption of surplus in various forms of waste expenditure. Here, by the way, we come to one of the fundamental underlying causes of the decline of the system. Roman imperialism didn't raise productivity. Roman imperialism didn't raise output. The ruling class enriched itself not in that way, but in two other ways. It did it by using military force to seize the surpluses which were already controlled by other ruling classes. A violent process, a destructive process, a partly destructive process that doesn't have any impact on raising the level of technique. And then secondly, it increased its control of surplus by raising the rate of exploitation on the people living inside the empire, creaming off an increasing proportion of the wealth that they produce, which undermines both the well-being and the productivity of the producing classes. It was a predatory system, in other words, of robbery with violence. But it has geographical limits. Now the danger here is one gets accused of, in developing this argument, one gets accused of geographical determinism, so let me say right at the outset, geography is real. Geography is a material constraint. Geography is a factor on affecting the ability of social systems to operate successfully. So I am going to introduce an element of geographical determinism into the argument, and it's essentially this. War was profitable and was a mechanism for subsidizing the system and for enriching the Roman ruling class when war was focused on the ploughlands. The areas which had already been cleared, which were under the plough, which were yielding significant agricultural surpluses, which could be taxed. Roman imperialism was not profitable once it attempted to move into areas which were effectively wilderness. Areas of mountains, of hills, of deserts, of uncleared forest, and so on, where you had relatively small and relatively impoverished populations rather than large populations of successful peasant farmers generating large surpluses. And if you think about the limits of the Roman Empire, it conforms to that model. They failed to conquer Scotland, which is essentially highland. They failed to conquer Germany, most of which in antiquity was still uncleared forest. They failed to conquer beyond the limits of the deserts and the mountains in North Africa and so on. Most of the Roman frontiers actually lie at the limit of the ploughlands as they were 2,000 years ago, with wilderness lying beyond the frontier line. The one significant exception to that was the East, where the Parthian Empire and subsequently the Sassanid Empire, based in Iraq and Iran, constituted in that region a superpower of sufficient size and wealth and strength to be able to block Roman imperial advance. So there was a kind of standoff in the east. But you've got then geographical and geopolitical limits to the ability of the system to expand. It's illustrated particularly, I think, in events which take place in the early 2nd century AD, when Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, launched a major offensive in the east, a major attack on Iraq, in fact succeeded in overrunning Iraq initially, and then faced a massive revolt from within, very, very similar actually to the trajectory of recent imperial adventures in that country. An initial blitzkrieg success, and then of course Iraq explodes. Hadrian, his successor's response to that is to draw the conclusion that the empire is overextended. And that's why Hadrian is associated with these great frontier works. It's a massive U-turn in Roman imperial policy. There is a sense in which Hadrian's Wall is a monument to the Iraqi resistance 2,000 years ago. There's a sense in which that is true. Up until this point, war has subsidized the empire. From now on, the empire has to subsidize war, because they have to maintain the army, they have to maintain the frontier defences without the subsidy of war booty, of new gains actually being brought into the system. Now what that means quite simply is taxes go up, rents go up, forced labour demands on the peasant population of the empire increase, arbitrary military requisitioning and billeting increases. I mean, the ancient sources are full of references to these kinds of problems and people resisting the demands that are being made on them. Full of references to this in the 3rd century, 4th century and 5th century AD. Not just references to the problem of overtaxation, of farms becoming non-viable, of land being abandoned, but also references to endemic banditry in the more outlying parts of the countryside, as people give up trying to make a living on overtaxed land and try and live outside the law. And so you've got a situation where the system, in order to maintain itself, begins to eat into its own socio-economic base. Let me put it in this way, that what they had done previously was they had creamed off surplus at the expense of increasing productivity. What they now do is they cream off even more surplus at the expense of simple reproduction, so that the more marginal farms go out of existence. And there is a spiral of decline. Because if overtaxation forces marginal farms over the edge, you shrink the tax base. There's a shortfall in the tax take, and that means you haven't got enough money to pay the army, to equip enough soldiers, to maintain frontier fortifications. So when you go back, you have to increase the percentage that you need to take further, and that pushes another swathe of marginal farms over the edge. So the tax base shrinks if it is subject to this kind of creaming off through super exploitation of amounts of surplus necessary to maintain the military bureaucratic complex that actually the underlying agricultural base of the system can't maintain. There is very strong archaeological evidence to support that model of what is going on in the period of decline. The great period of monumental building is in the 2nd century AD. And then if you look at what's happening in the 3rd century AD and the 4th century AD, and certainly by the 5th century AD, you see a collapse in great building. You see a decline of the towns. You see resources still being invested, but the resources are actually now being invested in military defences, in the militarisation of the empire, not in creating the infrastructures of civilization. So we have this cycle of decline, which is a kind of slow motion process of Roman imperial decline, as the attempt to maintain the system involves eating into the agricultural base and the ability of the agricultural base to reproduce itself. This is a long-term developing systemic crisis. but you still need an agent of destruction to bring the empire down. And that agent of destruction comes not from inside the empire. There is no revolutionary class inside the empire that can remodel it by revolt from within and create a new social order. The agent of destruction comes from the outside. The agent of destruction, essentially the Germanic barbarians, I put that in inverted commas, the Germanic barbarians beyond the Rhine and the Danube frontier. The impact of Rome and the internal crisis of the Roman Empire has had the effect of shifting the geopolitical balance. It's had the effect of shifting the geopolitical balance partly by the empire constituting a standing military threat to the Germanic tribes, which has forced changes in Germanic society, and the decline of the empire relative to those Germanic societies means that over time it becomes increasingly difficult for the Romans to keep the barbarians out. And I want to end by talking a little bit about this contrast between two different social systems that are in action in the 4th and the 5th century AD, and particularly from the period AD 406 to 7. At the end of the year, AD 406, there was a gigantic invasion of Germanic tribesmen across the frozen River Rhine. And the Roman frontier defences on the Rhine were overwhelmed, and they were never restored. The archaeology is absolutely clear about that. The Roman military defence on the Rhineland collapses. And then there's a period of 2 generations, really, when there's a complicated conflict between different Germanic tribes on the one hand, some of them fighting the Romans, some of them in alliance with the Romans, and elements, residual elements of the Roman state. A complicated struggle between these different forces over a period of 2 generations, culminating in the final collapse of the Western Empire, and the Western Empire becoming a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. Now this represents a huge geopolitical shift. 500 years before, the Romans had smashed the Germans. Now the Germans smash the Western Roman Empire. Why is there that difference? And it can't be explained simply in terms of the barbarians. It has to be explained in terms of what is happening inside the empire. I want to make 3 points about this Germanic society which becomes the agent of the destruction of the empire. The first is this. In Germanic society, it's quite clear there were much lower levels of surplus extraction from the primary producers than was the case in the Roman Empire. The late Roman Empire is made up of landlords and serfs. The Germanic states, proto-states if you like, were formed of relatively free and prosperous peasants. That's the first point. The second point is that because of that, there were far lower levels of waste consumption in Germanic society than was the case in the Roman Empire. You look at the archaeology of the Roman Empire, and you can see, the historical sources are clear. It's run by generals and officials and bishops and other social parasites. It's filled with forts, with defensive walls, with villas, with towns, with monumental architecture, and so on, with a luxury lifestyle at the top of society. This is all, in a sense, waste consumption. You contrast that with the archaeological imprint of the Germanic proto-state, and you've got hardly any of that represented at all. So you haven't got those huge levels of surplus extraction and waste consumption. And then the third point to make about the Germans is that the threat of Roman imperialism over a period of 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries had the effect of causing the Germanic tribes to coalesce into coalitions, into confederations, and under the authority of kings. In other words, they had become proto-states in order to concentrate the military force necessary to be able to withstand Roman aggression. So in the 5th century AD, what is happening is that these powerful polities these tribal confederations ruled by kings are able to mobilize mass armies of free warriors and turn them into a dynamic force for revolutionary change and constitute the embryonic new states that are going to develop out of the wreckage of the Roman Empire. That's why, because of those differences between decaying Roman society and Germanic society on the other, after just 2 generations after the initial breakthrough on the Rhine, the Germanic invaders were able to bring down the Western Roman Empire, hollowed out by the processes which I have described, and replace that empire with the patchwork of states which is going to give Europe its medieval shape. There you go. Right, well, the usual caveat in relation to the summing up, which is that so much has been said that it's just not going to be possible to deal with it all comprehensively, and what comes out now might not be entirely coherent as I try and patch together different questions and themes that have come up in what I think was an excellent discussion, actually. I'll start by just dealing with some of the more straightforward questions, and then I'll focus at the end particularly on this very useful question about what do we mean by progress, because we can actually generalise out from that beyond the Roman Empire. Why were the Romans so successful? If the Roman Empire was not a progressive social formation, I think that they were immensely successful imperialists because of the way in which, right from the beginning of the development of the empire, they had a systematic policy of Romanizing among the conquered. So that as the empire expanded, the social base of the empire was enlarged. I mean, one ancient historian put it very well when he said that the way in which Roman robbery with violence worked was that they would enrol the victims of the last robbery in the gang and invite them to participate in the next robbery. And there is a sense in which that's exactly what they're doing. So as the empire expands, you get Romanized aristocrats who become stakeholders in the system, aristocrats of native descent, who become the basis of maintaining order and collecting the taxes in the expanding empire, and also you recruit the soldiers from a wider base, and you give the soldiers a share in the distribution of booty. So what you're doing as the system expands is that you're expanding its social base. You're expanding that base of the beneficiaries of the system. And I don't think, just because a system is irrational, and it is irrational, I'm going to talk a little bit about irrationality in a moment when talking about class society. Just because a system is irrational doesn't necessarily mean that it can't last for a very long time. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the nature of the class struggle in the Roman Empire and what I think caused it another part of the explanation really as to why it lasted so long. Quick comment on the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire survived, I think, for this reason. 2/3 of the tax revenue came from the East. 2/3 of the soldiers were deployed in the West. Now that's to do with geography, and it's to do with the wealth of the two different sides of the empire. That meant when the Western Empire went down, when the Eastern Empire stopped subsidising it, the Eastern Empire actually had the resources to survive as the Byzantine Empire. I think actually it's as simple as that. That the empire was only coherent as long as there was actually enough tax revenue being generated to defend all of the frontiers, and it split on that line when the East could see that it needed its own resources to stop going down the way the West was going, and once the subsidy was cut off, the West collapsed. What's the role of Christianity? I don't think we should underestimate the significance of the great monotheistic religion in human history, not least Christianity. And the thing about monotheism is it's a universalizing ideology. So everybody can join, everybody can be part of it. And that can be used by the ruling class, and it can be used by the subject class. The Christians were persecuted for much of the history of the Roman Empire because they had a universal message which meant that potentially they could group large numbers of people across the various cultural boundaries which existed in the empire, perhaps into a subversive force. But equally the state can use it. The state can take that universal message, and when the state becomes the patron and the protector of the church, the emperor becomes a crusader, of course, defending the church, and the church then becomes an ideological apparatus, preaching loyalty to the state. So universalism as an ideology, which is there in the monotheistic religions, is very important in the development of human ideology and human culture, but it can be used by different social classes in different ways. Class struggle in the Roman Empire. I didn't talk a lot about class struggle inside the Roman Empire, but so let me say a quick word about it now. The struggle between patricians and plebeians in the 5th and the 4th century BC was fundamental to the character of the system. And the result was a class compromise. And the class compromise was that there were restrictions on the degree to which the Roman aristocracy, the patricians, could screw the plebeians, the peasant farmers. And if there are limits on how far you can screw your own population, you have to look outside the system to accumulate surplus. What you also do is you give the free citizen peasant farmers, because they've got protection within the constitutional system, a stake in successful warfare. Because they get a share in the booty. That's the basis of the power of allegiance. That's the basis of the power of Roman imperialism, that class compromise between patricians and plebeians that's the result of the struggle of the orders. It's absolutely fundamental to the strength of the system. But you can have crises where there's no clear revolutionary class, and therefore no clear outcome. And I mean, Neil is absolutely right, of course. Spartacus could not have remade the world and created a new social order. I mean, had the slaves escaped, they'd have gone back to being peasant farmers. My argument is actually that would have been progressive, because then you would have had more of the surplus actually in the hands of those who were working and producing things at the base of the system, and less of the surplus actually being siphoned upwards into waste expenditure. But of course you can have all sorts of situations in history where there's a crisis, but there's not a revolutionary class able to offer a solution to the crisis. Which is why the great crisis of the late Republic takes the form of struggles between competing aristocratic warlords, putting themselves at the heads of these different coalitions of forces within Roman society in the 1st century BC. You can have a crisis in the 3rd and the 4th century AD, as the Roman Empire declines, where there is no revolutionary class, because the peasantry is so scattered and the gentry is so scattered. Actually, the only coherent national class is the Roman ruling class, based on the state. So even though the crisis is deep and getting deeper, it's able to hold on and remodel the state and increase the level of exploitation that it needs in order to sustain itself. And this is part of another question, really, about why did they do it? Why did they eat into the social and economic fabric of the system on which they were dependent? Because they had no choice. Because they were locked into a geopolitical competition. So they had to accumulate military resources in order to defend themselves against internal enemies, in order to defend themselves against the enemy without. They had no choice but to ratchet up the levels of taxation to a point which was eating away. In the long run, in the short run, it creates an army. In the long run, it reduces the tax base, and so the system is dying. But the ruling class is trapped by the situation in which it finds itself. The big question: what is progress? I'll tell you what's not progress. In the ancient world literature, actually because it's only for the elite, aqueducts. I'll tell you what the aqueducts do. The aqueducts bring water into the towns to power the fountains in the aristocracy's gardens. They've done excavations, I'll tell you, they've done excavations in Pompeii where the pipes that carry the water into grand houses don't go into the kitchen. They go into the garden to feed the fountains. The aqueducts are not about raising the productivity of labour. The aqueducts are about maintaining the infrastructure of civilization, the aristocratic lifestyle that is associated with the towns. Are roads a good thing? No. I'll tell you what it means. I'll tell you what it means. It means the tax collector can get to you. It means the landlord's bailiff can get to you. It means the soldiers can get to you. It's bad news if you're a peasant farmer when you see them building a road. All of these questions are class questions. And that famous sketch in Life of Brian, there's a problem with that famous sketch in Life of Brian. You know, all of those benefits of Roman rule, I know it's a brilliant sketch, but actually the message is wrong. Because all of the benefits, they represent a consumption of surplus. A consumption of surplus that supports the town-based elite and the villa-owning elite. It's not a consumption of surplus, which is productive in terms of developing technique and the productivity of labour on the land. So I am with Gordon Childe on this question. Gordon Childe, and in my view the greatest archaeologist of all time. Gordon Childe's position, he's a Marxist, working mainly in the 20s and the 30s. His position was very clear. He said, pyramids, ziggurats, temples, armies, empires, it's all waste expenditure. It contributes nothing to the development of humanity. What is progress? He defined progress. He said progress is about labour, and it's about making labour more effective. And labour is fundamental to the definition of what we are as a species. Why do we engage in collective labour? We engage in collective labour to provide ourselves with the things we need to make life possible and better. Therefore, progress means the use of human labour to make labour more effective, more efficient, more productive, so we can satisfy more of our needs more successfully. That's absolutely, fundamentally true throughout the whole of human history, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why we want to make socialist revolutions, so that we can end waste expenditure on surpluses and use surpluses productively. And there's growing evidence to suggest that progress in that sense is bound up to the degree to which sections of the producing classes control surplus. And I'm going to end with this example, because it's better documented and better researched than the stuff about late antiquity. The work that's being done now on medieval England, particularly by Chris Dyer, is showing how the innovations in agriculture which give rise to commercial farming are coming not from the top. And the reason they're not coming from the top is because the top is engaged in feudal-type competition, and therefore in waste expenditure. The people who are the rich peasants and the lower gentry, who are actually at the point of production and who are engaged in productive processes, they're the people who are doing the innovation. And that is what you would expect, because in the 16th century, those are the people who drive the Protestant Reformation, and in the 17th century, those are the people who smash royalism as Cromwell's Ironsides. In other words, it's the middling sort who are the people in the ancient world and in the medieval world who have the capacity to achieve progress to the degree that they control surplus. So we're always on the side of revolt from below against the elite and the way in which they waste the wealth of the world. There you go.